No matter where or when you are from, I'm sure you'll agree that Rolls-Royce is the world's principal luxury car marque. And in defending that status for over a century, there is one everlasting protection: relative scarcity. One model in their history, however, overtly abandoned that principle, becoming, of course, their most popular model, but also their most consequential. So today on TwinCam, and on the occasion of its 60th birthday, this is the Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow. Before we get into it, this car is to be auctioned by Monocoque Classics. So if you could see yourself floating about in this most stately of saloon cars, then please do follow the link in the description. But we know Rolls-Royce today as a very self-assured company. Under the wing of BMW, they hardly have to worry about the day-to-day business of politics and economics, instead being able to direct all of their attention towards the cars they build. 60-odd years ago, however, that wasn't quite the case. So before going anywhere else, we're going to need a bit of a history lesson. To those of you over a certain age, it would be obvious for me to say that the world's two premier luxury car marques, Rolls-Royce and Bentley, were once one and the same. However, it's now coming up to 30 years since their divorce proceedings began. So let us rewind not to the early 1960s, but all the way back to 1931. In a world where the motor car remained the preserve of the wealthy, Rolls-Royce were already building the self-proclaimed best car in the world. Bentley, however, were on a very different footing. They were founded only 12 years previously, yet had won 5 in the first 8 runnings of the Le Mans 24 Hours. Huge superchargers weren't cheap though, and the Great Depression forced Bentley into the hands of Rolls-Royce. Fast forward 94 years, and the two marques have been knocked back into their original orbits. But in the early 1960s, Bentley were lodged firmly under the wing of their much more conservative parent. The Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow and Bentley T-Series, therefore, are essentially one and the same, and while their marketing department may have been at pains to prove otherwise, they are rather interchangeable. Regardless, Rolls-Royce stood as they do today at the summit of the motoring world, the Rolls-Royce Phantom looking down on the plebeian class, and if you think today's Phantom is exclusive, then you ain't seen nothing yet. With only 1,224 examples produced across 40 years, it wasn't unusual for a Phantom to cost the modern equivalent of £1 million. Instead, the options for those who weren't a Commander-in-Chief were a Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud or a Bentley S3, a pair of deeply traditional luxury cars. Their replacement was, of course, our friend the Silver Shadow. And while these cars are best known for being the most numerous Rolls-Royce, the title I've given this video is by no means a misnomer. Indeed, back in 1965, these cars were radical, marking a total departure for Rolls-Royce and Bentley, dominating their styling themes for the best part of 40 years. But in spite of that statement, I want to get something very clear. Rolls-Royce do not innovate. They didn't then, and they certainly won't in the future. Instead, they cherry-pick what's worked best for other manufacturers, re-engineering it to suit the solidity and luxury of their cars, and that is the lens through which we can see the creation of this car. The Shadow and T-Series had a list of Rolls-Royce firsts as long as your forearm, and at the top of that list is that this was their first car to feature monocoque construction. All this means is that, like something as humble as a Morris Minor, the Shadow doesn't have a separate chassis on which the body is then placed. Yet such a simple and expected innovation naturally leads us to a little more history, as this could well have placed a roadblock in front of the car's future. You see, back in the era we've just discussed, when motoring itself remained a luxury, the buyer of a Rolls-Royce or Bentley expected an incredible level of personalisation. What they usually did was buy a rolling chassis, that is, a frame with suspension and engine attached, then take it away to be clothed by a traditional coach builder. Following the Second World War, however, buying habits changed considerably, and as motoring was gradually democratised, people were now searching for a finished product from Rolls-Royce and Bentley. No longer could they operate as simple engineers, and in 1946 Bentley launched the Mark VI, followed 3 years later by the Rolls-Royce Silver Dawn, both complete with their first mass-produced factory body. However, these cars were constructed as before, with a separate chassis, therefore retaining the ability to receive a coach-built body. Nonetheless, the road to standardisation had begun, and that's why our Silver Shadow matters, because this is the car that formalised the modern process of buying a Rolls-Royce or Bentley saloon. But if unitary construction had the opportunity to cloud the perception of Rolls-Royce, then why did they chase it? Well, a monocoque had already become the norm because it was just better. A unibody car is lighter, safer, better to drive, and most importantly, smaller. That sounds a somewhat strange thing to list as a net positive in this context, but switching to a monocoque allowed for considerably better packaging, meaning just as much interior space in a car 9 centimetres narrower and 18 centimetres shorter than its predecessor. The Shadow could therefore be less ostentatious and wasteful than its father, a fact that by 1965 was of growing concern, considering the expressiveness and sheer heft of a traditional Rolls-Royce or Bentley. Indeed, this idea first appealed to them a whole decade earlier, leading to discussions with BMC that came to little, but whose ideas were later folded into the Shadow. Despite what some people say, size does matter, because British roads were becoming more congested, it being no longer deemed acceptable or indeed classy for a car, even a Rolls-Royce, to be vividly wasteful. Their new car had to be elegant yet tasteful, in a manner I'm sure they'd seen Jaguar fail at with the bloated Mark X. Belatedly therefore, Rolls-Royce were catching up with the game, Lancia and Citroën, for example, having used it since the 1920s and 30s respectively. The latter, however, always the innovator compared to Rolls-Royce's conservatism, would be the source of the Silver Shadow's other major advance: its suspension. Before addressing those details, however, I want us to gain a sense of the modernisation we're witnessing here. Back in 1965, a Silver Cloud may have been very regal, even quite pretty, but nothing about it was modern. Rolls-Royce could no longer stick its fingers in its ears and pretend the modern world didn't exist. It was now 20 years since the end of the war, and while Great Britain had soldiered on with its existing infrastructure, the rest of Europe had moved on. In 1963, Mercedes-Benz launched the 600, known as the Grosser or Grand Mercedes, meaning that if Rolls-Royce was to maintain its reputation, then it was the best in the world or nothing. A monocoque body shell was a very good start, but the Silver Cloud still had a live axle and drum brakes. So who in the mid-1960s did suspension and brakes better than anyone else in the world? It had to be Citroën. In 1955, the French had essentially cracked the art of ride quality with their stratospherically clever Citroën DS. Not only did it look as though it was from the stratosphere, but the car known as the Goddess lay claim to a hydropneumatic system that controlled its suspension, steering and brakes. A DS did without archaic physical springs. Instead, it had a set of funny-looking green spheres, which were supplied with high-pressure hydraulic fluid from an engine-driven pump. Inside the spheres, the non-compressible fluid passed through the valves to damp the suspension, while its travel around the car controlled the ride height. Springing was performed by very compressible nitrogen gas, sealed from the rest of the system by a set of rubber diaphragms, the two combining to produce one of the best riding cars the world has ever seen. The DS was so good that its properties were regularly emulated, first and most famously by BMC, but also by the grocer Mercedes, whose hydraulic system even powered the windows. Rolls-Royce, however, would go one step further, licensing the entire system from Citroën. The Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow therefore floats on a cushion of fluid and air, but famously the Citroëns that used hydropneumatic suspension could rise and fall, with a lever in the middle of the car that allowed them to traverse tricky terrain or to become streamliners on motorways. But in order to suit the kind of solidity and the presence of a Rolls-Royce, this car cannot perform that party trick. That is because it also has a set of conventional coil springs atop all the hydraulic system. So really, all the Citroën stuff is there more for self-leveling. What this suspension also has, however, are double wishbones at the front and trailing arms at the rear. So while it's maybe not quite as clever, maybe not quite as novel as that of a Citroën, it is still possibly the best suspension in the world. And we will touch very briefly on steering and handling and all that kind of stuff. And the car just feels very adequate. That's a word that's going to be coming up quite a bit in this road test. There is nothing really that, discerns it from many other big floaty luxury cars, but it feels very capable nonetheless. It doesn't feel as though you could get it in an unfortunate situation. It doesn't feel as though very quickly you could end up with the car facing the wrong way or doing something stupid. But it doesn't like to be hurried. I don't know how many turns this steering is lock to lock, but you're about to see it's quite a lot. And that means that you don't really want to go anywhere all that quickly, because it means you have to do a heck of a lot of arm twirling in order to correct yourself again. But you do feel above everyone else. You sit so high in this car with such a commanding view over the bonnet, and although this car is not enormously tall by modern standards, the seating position nonetheless is incredibly high. What it's all about, however, of course, is the comfort. And we're about to go down a section of road here with a few speed bumps in it, so we'll see exactly how it feels. But you can feel the car waving. It doesn't remain totally flat and totally stationary all the time. Instead, it does move about a little bit. And if we go over a speed bump, yeah, we can kind of feel it a little bit, but it is so marvelously damped out. The suspension is not stupidly soft, so the car ends up pitching and diving everywhere. It is incredibly well damped. And that self-leveling system, the way it's connected front to rear, and then those damping valves, that will be why it feels so competent. So rather than having this incredibly wallowy ride, we instead have a very well controlled ride. And that's something that maybe shouldn't have surprised me with my knowledge of how these Citroën-based suspension systems work, but nonetheless, it's very, very nice to feel. But it does also mean, however, that I'm always informed of the road surface beneath me in a manner that I don't feel as though I have to be. This is not a car that is built for handling or for going quickly in any way. I'm poodling it down this road, in fact, slower than I would in any other car that I test for this channel, all because it just doesn't feel like it wants to be rushed. But when I go over a big pothole like that, I can feel it, and I can hear it as well. And so I think it could be even softer than it is and get away with it. This kind of aspect to the brilliant damping, and therefore you can have slightly stiffer springing, suits many other cars. It suits many smaller cars in particular. But for something quite as big as this and quite as wallowy as this in terms of its body and its weight, I don't think it's quite necessary. But, the thing about this car is it is just so very, very competent. It's not a car that you want to take out for a drive on an occasion just to go for a drive. Instead, it's the kind of car that you just want to sit back, relax, and really enjoy a journey in. Just take it slowly and treat it as an occasion, sure, but not a driving occasion more a travelling occasion. You wouldn't fly first class over to Europe because it's too short a flight. You instead fly first class over to the United States. You do a long flight in first class because it's an occasion. That is what this car feels like. It's not the car you would take to Tesco. It's the car you would take on a big, long cross-country cruise. And you know what? Considering it's such a huge car, it doesn't stop badly either. In our earlier discussion of Citroën's Hydropneumatics, we mentioned its integration into the DS's braking system. And although the Shadow's brakes are, again, not lifted from Citroën, I'd wager that all this technology gave way to another Rolls-Royce first: disc brakes. Discs aren't something to really shout about for 1965, but such is the conservatism that the Silver Cloud retained drums all round. Now sure, drums are quieter, cleaner and more reliable than discs, but you'd imagine that with some keen driving, especially with this all-new suspension and, probably in a Bentley, an old set of drum brakes would easily overheat. The Shadow therefore took that leap, bringing discs to every corner. But fortunately, unlike a Mercedes-Benz, the hydraulics did not stretch to the comfort options. The Bentley T and Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow may have been relatively radical beneath, but they certainly were not a revolution internally, barring all the extra room freed up by their construction. It's all very traditional in here, with trees and cows abound and a very British approach to ergonomics. There's a charming higgledy-pigglediness to the dashboard, but it's ever so lovely. I adore the old-fashioned approach to luxury, where materials and comfort, as opposed to sheer technology, are brought to the coalface. Saying that, this car does have electric seats, and for this era, that's very nice as well. Without even the modernity of head restraints, this car really does feel like a lounge rather than a motor car. The vibe in here might not be radical, but with its new platform, there's only one major mechanical component carried over from the old car, and it's a good one. The legendary and invincible 6.25 litre L-Series V8. This big overhead valve lump of iron dates back to 1959, so it was only 6 years old by the time the Shadow was introduced. And in the greatest of Rolls-Royce traditions, there was no official power figure. All 6.25 litres of it, but it was described as being adequate. And that, of course, is exactly what it is. A little bit later than this car, this particular one's in 1968, a few years later, it was increased to the now iconic 6.75 litre capacity. And in that form, these cars produced something a little bit over 200 brake horsepower. But again, it just doesn't matter. Instead, what this V8 delivers you, and unlike a straight 6 or a V12, it doesn't offer absolute smoothness and absolute sonority. But having a V8 gives you tractability. And in a car where you don't want to even know the engine exists, that is just perfect. It means that we can glide about the place, and unless you're going up a hill really very, very slowly and losing speed, you never feel a gear change from this automatic box. You never feel anything happen. You never really hear the engine either unless you really plant your foot down. Instead, you just make gentle progress. You just make very, very acceptable, very smooth progress. So we're heading up a hill now and we're accelerating, and you can barely hear the engine. In fact, what you can hear in here more is the creaking of all the leather. You can hear the interior, and you can genuinely, it's not a myth, it's not a rumour, you can hear the clock more than you can hear the engine. Now, I don't know what it's like at 100 miles per hour, but the vibe this car is giving me is so absolutely perfect for how you would expect a good and proper classic Rolls-Royce to feel. I love motoring in the mid-1960s. It was a time of kind of optimism of freedom. And while there are some horrendous ills that come with that, car centricism, all that kind of stuff, it means that for the motorist, it was just a brilliant time to be about, both in terms of the models that were being offered, the improvement to the road network, etc. And you can see that come across in some period reviews of the Shadow. Notice I'm palming the steering wheel, very important to do in one of these. But in Motorsport's initial test of the Shadow, they said it felt cooped up at 70 miles per hour. They said that it felt, can't remember exactly how they described it. I think they described it as being like sleds placed under the wheels of a horse-drawn cart. Instead, they said that it would more like to devour continental roads at 110 miles per hour and more. And that is testament to how this car is set up. At these normal road speeds, it feels very suitable, very livable. It's not fast, certainly, but it gains its pace with a severe sense of delicacy and elegance. It just goes about its business. But when Rolls-Royce and Bentley split up near the turn of the millennium, it was Bentley that retained the old Rolls-Royce facilities and the old Rolls-Royce intellectual property. The new BMW Rolls-Royce is a brand new company based in a totally different location with none of the active history involved. And so Bentley kept the rights to this L-Series V8. And you could still get this very same engine, albeit with two big turbochargers on it, in the Bentley Mulsanne until 2020. That is testament to not only how adequate this engine is, I use that word again, how adequate it is, but also how tough it is. Just how marvelously well engineered and smooth and capable in producing the power it is, that it lasted for 61 years in production. 61 years. There's a fair amount of pedigree, therefore, in our Shadow here. It gives us that sense of purpose. It gives us that sense of solidity that we, of course, want from a car like this. But the longevity also brings us to simply the passage of time. The Silver Shadow and Bentley T were technical marvels back in 1965, but a combination of their popularity and Rolls-Royce's inability to replace them has brought what I feel is an unwarranted reputation. The simple fact that these are the most popular and therefore successful Rolls-Royces of all time cannot be understated. Across 15 years, they built just under 32,400 examples. And if we compare that to the fewer than 8,000 Silver Clouds produced, then you can see why this was such a big deal. Of course, there are numerous factors that led to this success, but I feel the styling was a major driver. I must admit that I do not believe the Shadow is a pretty car. Instead, it's immensely elegant and understated, considering what it is. Because with the drive to reduce its heft, the Rolls-Royce as a genre took on the classic three-box silhouette. The flowing wheel arches were relegated to history, replaced with a more delicate expression of character. In fact, every single styling feature was new, barring the quad headlamps and traditional grille, both of which are pristinely integrated. It has that upright appearance you'd expect from a Rolls-Royce, all while not sticking out. The Silver Shadow is a car you could park on a street corner, yet not feel pretentious. Instead, you are assured that yours is the smartest car on the street. Back in 1965, the vibe of these cars was perfect. Understated yet characterful, and modern yet solid. But back then, tastes moved on so much more quickly than they do today, and allied to their relative commonality, 15 years of Silver Shadow production somewhat affected the aura of a Rolls-Royce. Not existentially, but these cars became criminally cheap on the second-hand market, and when their successors finally came along, the Rolls-Royce Silver Spirit and Bentley Mulsanne, they too carried an eerily similar style. In fact, this silhouette would run from 1965 all the way through to 2002, by which point both marques desperately needed to reinvent themselves. Taken in a narrow field of view, therefore, these cars are the most successful and probably consequential Rolls-Royces ever built. Yet taken in a wider view, they sowed the seeds for a period of total stagnation. The ability to appreciate nuance is an incredibly powerful virtue, because both of those things can be true, and our perception depends only on what we want to do with it. So with that, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please do follow the link in the description. And I'll have more videos coming along soon.